The leak of a first draft of the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade and give individual states the power to legislate abortion is causing the debate to emerge once again. Andrea Mrozek is a senior fellow with Cardus Family, and she joins me now. Thanks so much for joining us today, Andrea.
Thanks for having me.
So, Andrea, is the Supreme Court's decision surprising, given that Roe v. Wade has been the status quo for almost 50 years?
I find it incredibly surprising, but at the same time, we have to notice that there's been a pretty consistent chipping away on the state level, changing of laws at the state level in the United States also over those 50 years. So while I was completely surprised at the leak, I think it actually reflects genuine sentiment in the United States that varies. So Roe v. Wade basically put a thin veneer over every state saying you have to do a particular thing that states didn't always agree with. And they haven't been agreeing, they've been dissenting and making laws. And that's how we come to see this decision leaked about changing Roe v. Wade and the end of Roe v. Wade.
Okay. Following this leak, Prime Minister Trudeau promised to protect abortion rights in Canada, but Canada doesn't have a law pertaining to abortion. Why is that important to define?
It's so important, and politicians are banding around abortion rights. There isn't actually a right to abortion in Canada, and I think that's something that there's consensus between scholars who both support abortion and those who oppose abortion, that Canada doesn't have a right to abortion. So our Morgentaler decision in 1988 decided that the Parliament needs to legislate on abortion and identified it as the thorny moral issue that it is. So getting the terms right actually really matters, and our politicians are not accurately portraying the situation in Canada right now.
As I've been doing research, Andrea, on all of this that's been transpiring and the conversation around abortion specifically in our country, realizing that people don't realize that without a law, provisions mean that someone can get an abortion up to almost the due date of a pregnancy. There aren't a lot of restrictions. We talk about sex selective abortion is also legal here in Canada. Talk about maybe some of the nuances that come with not having a law that maybe people don't understand here in Canada.
Yeah, and actually I'm glad you used the word nuance, because I think that apart from the media, there is actually a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of points of consensus on this issue, as divisive as it is. You just raised one, which is sex selection abortion. Polling shows virtually no one supports that. And a lack of awareness, as you mentioned, on later term abortions, and much disagreement over whether those actually happen or not. Whether they're common or not isn't really the point, insofar as understanding that we have a legal vacuum and that there is no restrictions, and it doesn't contrast favorably with places internationally. So leaving apart the United States, in Europe, for example, I know it's been cited in the media, and that the Mississippi law, which was restricting abortion after 15 weeks gestation, is actually more lenient than the law of France on abortion. So European countries have legislated on abortion in ways that the United States hasn't been allowed to do in states where people support some restrictions on abortion.
It is a divisive issue, both politically and culturally. Pro-choice advocates call this a women's rights issue. And as you said in a recent column, even celebrate the idea of abortion. Is there a disconnect between the activism around pro-choice and the reality of who is getting an abortion?
Yeah, I really believe there is a terrible break between the experiences of women who would probably categorize abortion as a sad interlude in their lives, something sad, not something to be celebrated. And I think what we've seen on the activist file is a movement away from safe, legal, and rare, which is from a bygone era, and abortion, from those who supported abortion, isn't talked in those terms anymore. People talk about shouting your abortion, celebrating abortion, and I think that's done a real disservice to their cause, but more importantly to me, it's done a disservice to the women they claim to represent, who hold this as a sadness and a sad story, a sad, perhaps necessary thing in their lives. I think recognizing that on the part of abortion activists, and obviously I'm not one, would have been much more helpful for advancing their cause. The culture is shifting toward life, and I frankly think that a really extreme form of abortion activism probably contributes to that.
Talk about that. When Roe v. Wade was first passed, you're right. I mean, culture was different, life was different, access to services was different. And yet I sometimes feel like the conversation when it comes to pro-choice is still kind of stuck there and has not moved with the times and access to services like there are now. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think it was a different era and a different time. And one thing you didn't mention that was very different 50 years ago was the science and the ability to see in utero and to take pictures of babies in the womb. I think personally that every woman knows what's happening when they go for an abortion or when they consider the question of abortion. They know the reality of what it is that's happening. But it was concealed, I think, from public eye, more or less, and the science has advanced. We see surgeries done in utero. We've also seen extremely large changes in viability. The age of viability has really changed, and that leads, like, the changing of the ability to help a baby survive when they're born extremely prematurely leads to some terrible circumstances where you can be supporting a baby at 28 weeks gestation, or alternatively aborting a baby at 28 weeks gestation. I'm just citing that number randomly, but you see my point. That is untenable, really.
Yeah. Pro-choice activists say making abortion illegal or having stricter abortion laws will hurt the most vulnerable, and the statistics back this up. A New York Times article states that women in their 20s, unmarried, low income, who already have a child, are those that are accessing abortion more than anybody else. This article also says that women are disproportionately likely to be Black that are accessing abortion. What would stricter abortion laws mean for the vulnerable women in our society?
Well, abortion isn't exclusively a question of laws, and I don't know anybody who wants to see a law clamp down and then have women suffering and returning to, for example, back alley abortions. I think what we want is the culture is changing. The laws are reflecting that, in partnership, working together, reaching a point where abortion becomes unthinkable would mean that we would have a law that reflects the value of human life, but also we would have a culture and a society that really supports women in their hour of need. So what we need to be working toward is both of these things happening. And I think they are happening. I think we're seeing the culture shift and the laws are shifting, particularly in the United States, to reflect more of a consensus point on the nature of life in the womb and when it matters, which Justice Bertha Wilson also suggested we need to grapple with that question. She's the Canadian dissent on Morgentaler, I believe. But we need to be talking with a lot more nuance about abortion, and then allowing the conversations to unfold, helping women in their hour of need, and ensuring that nobody is left behind if the law is going to change, for example, in the various states south of the border.
To be fair, Andrea, I hear that a lot from the pro-life side, but I don't hear concrete solutions. So I hear, support of women and that kind of verbiage, but what does that mean? What does that look like? And how does the church come alongside, as opposed to just saying, we advocate for life in the womb and we advocate for life? What does that mean if a woman who is, lives in a marginalized situation, finds herself in a situation where she is pregnant with an unwanted pregnancy? How does the pro-life movement actually concretely support somebody in that situation?
Well, I think someone working for a pro-life charity would be better positioned to answer that. There are across the country that help with decision-making protocols, that help with the actual physical needs of increased financial needs when a baby comes into the picture, help with things like community support around childcare if a young woman needs to finish her education, et cetera, work. All those things come into play. I think we have some success stories. Not every pro-life charity is going to be perfect, but I do think we have some success stories around doing that well. We also know that there's no such thing as forced motherhood. So Babies can be born and put up for adoption, and there are so many families seeking to adopt. So that's something we shouldn't forget entirely, that forced motherhood is a misnomer. Nobody is compelling anybody to raise a child. We're really looking at respecting the dignity of the person in the womb and allowing them to live, and allowing the mother to live in, her own best life at the same time, which can mean adopting, giving up the child for adoption as well. So I think there's definitely room for improvement. Pro-life charities need to be supported and be allowed to keep their charitable status as a starting point for all that good work to continue to happen.
Last question for you, Andrea. Will the Supreme Court decision impact Canada's laws?
I don't think at all. I think it's just going to impact our politicking on it. We're going to see a spike in egregious statements about the nature of abortion in Canada that may or may not be true. It'll be used as a wedge issue in our politics. And otherwise, Canada is a different country with a different reality around the question of abortion.
All right, Andrea Mrozek, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.